At my sister's wedding, my father raised his glass, smiled, and said, "Not everyone's cut out for real service." Then he looked straight at me, his own daughter, and the room laughed. I smiled too, because that's what good daughters do. You learn to swallow the sting, turn it into silence, and call it grace. They thought my desk job in the Navy was a joke, paperwork, reports, nothing heroic, nothing worth a medal. But what they didn't know was who was sitting right behind him. Sometimes the truth doesn't need a microphone. It just waits patiently for the right moment to stand. Have you ever been laughed at by someone you love, someone who should have been proud of you, but chose to make you small instead? If yes, you're not alone. Before I tell you what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever proven someone wrong, not by shouting, but by showing, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe to Military Revenge, because what came next silenced the room. When I came home from deployment, the air in the house felt different. My father had always been the kind of man who filled every room with his voice, but that day the silence felt heavier than any command he had ever given. He was a Marine through and through. Rigid. Sharp. Certain discipline could fix anything that felt out of place. My sister inherited that confidence, and learned how to use it in business meetings and charity events. I had something quieter. I was the one who stayed up late filing reports, finishing briefings, building the kind of order no one ever saw but everyone depended on. He never said it directly, but I could feel the disappointment when he looked at me. He called me the clerk. When I was commissioned, he nodded as if I had joined a club for people who liked air conditioning more than combat. That afternoon he didn't ask how I was, or if my team had made it home safely. He asked if I had finally found a real job. I said the Navy was still paying me, which made him laugh. It was the kind of laugh that pushed people away. My mother tried to change the subject, but he had already turned back to the television. I remember sitting there, looking at the medals lined along his shelf, and realizing that no matter how much I achieved, they would never shine for him. My sister stopped by later with her fiancé to drop off wedding invitations. She was radiant, confident, exactly the daughter he liked to show off. Dad asked me if I'd wear a dress to the wedding instead of my uniform. I said I would think about it. He smiled the way a man smiles when he believes the argument is already won. The weeks before the wedding passed quietly, but in our family, quiet didn't mean peace. It meant tension folded neatly under routine. My mother polished the silverware, practiced her smile in the hallway mirror, and ignored the sharp edges in his voice. Sometimes I wanted to ask her why she stayed, why she still tried to smooth out storms that were never hers to calm. But I already knew. Some people fight by staying, some fight by leaving. The night before the ceremony, I ironed my dress blues in my old room. The window was open, and I could hear my father outside, talking to a neighbor about how proud he was of his Marine years, about how his eldest daughter was marrying a lawyer. When the neighbor asked about me, there was a pause, then a short laugh. He said I was working a desk job for the Navy, pushing paper somewhere in D.C. I stood there, hands still on the fabric, and felt that old familiar sting crawl up my spine. But I didn't cry. I'd learned long ago that tears never change men like him. Facts did. Integrity did. The kind of steady silence that waits for the truth to reveal itself. That night I decided I would wear my uniform. Not to provoke him, not to prove anything, but because it was who I was, and I was done pretending otherwise. If you've ever been made to feel small for doing something quiet but meaningful, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because sometimes the smallest act of standing your ground becomes the loudest sound in the room. When I walked into that wedding hall the next day, sunlight caught on the ribbons across my chest. My father noticed before anyone else did. His smile faltered just for a second, and then returned, stronger, brighter, the way a man masks surprise with pride he doesn't feel. He greeted the guests, told old stories from his service years, and avoided looking at me directly. My sister hugged me and whispered that I looked beautiful, though her eyes flickered toward Dad as if asking permission to mean it. During the ceremony I sat near the back. The music, the flowers, the soft laughter, everything felt rehearsed. Perfect, predictable. Until the moment he took the microphone for his speech. That's when everything started to shift. He tapped the microphone twice, that confident rhythm he always used when he wanted everyone's attention. The chatter quieted, forks paused in midair. My father stood tall in his black suit, medals from another lifetime glinting under the chandeliers. His voice carried easily, steady and trained, the kind that could silence a room without effort. He started by thanking the guests, the caterers, the family who traveled from out of state. His smile was warm, rehearsed. He talked about my sister, how proud he was of her, how she'd built her business from the ground up, how she reminded him of himself. The crowd clapped, she blushed, and he soaked in the applause like sunlight. Then his tone shifted. He turned slightly, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. The corner of his mouth lifted. He said he was lucky to have raised 2 daughters, one who followed his footsteps into leadership, and another who chose a quieter path. He paused long enough for the laughter to begin on its own. He added that not everyone was cut out for real service. Some people preferred paperwork over pressure. The laughter grew. Even the band members smiled nervously. I felt the sound crawl through my uniform like static, each chuckle burning a small hole where pride used to live. I didn't look down. I didn't move. My hands stayed folded in my lap, the fabric of my dress blues stiff under the table's soft cloth. He lifted his glass and toasted to my sister's future, to family, to legacy. He never said my name. My mother sat 2 seats away, her smile frozen, knuckles white around her napkin. My sister glanced at me, guilt flickering across her face before she looked back at her husband. And me, I just breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the same way they teach you during fire drills at sea when you can't show fear. When the laughter died down, I caught the faintest sound behind me. The scrape of a chair, deliberate, slow. I didn't need to turn to know that someone had stood. A low voice murmured something polite to a passing waiter. Then silence, the kind of silence that changes the air in a room. My father didn't notice yet. He was too busy basking in the afterglow of his own punchline. He leaned toward my sister's husband and whispered something that made him laugh harder than necessary. I stared at the reflection of the chandelier in my water glass, its fractured light trembling with every vibration of the table. That's when I heard it, a calm, measured baritone, coming from behind my father's table. He said, "Colonel Foster, I hope you don't mind if I borrow the microphone for a moment." The laughter stopped instantly. My father turned, surprised, his confident grin faltering when he recognized the uniform. The man stepping forward was Rear Admiral Pierce, his posture immaculate, his expression unreadable. The ribbons across his chest shimmered under the lights, and his presence filled the space in a way no joke ever could. For a moment no one breathed. Then the Admiral smiled faintly and said, "I served with your daughter." The entire room shifted its weight. The servers froze in place. My father blinked, uncharacteristically lost for words. He managed a small nod, something between respect and confusion. The Admiral continued, "Her team provided intelligence support for an operation that saved more than a few of our people. We don't usually talk about that kind of work in public, but since her service was just mentioned, I thought it was worth acknowledging." His tone was calm, but every syllable landed like a verdict. My father's face was drained of color. He laughed once, weakly, as if to turn it back into a joke, but no one joined him. My sister's husband shifted uncomfortably. My mother exhaled quietly, her first real breath in minutes. The Admiral placed a hand on my shoulder as he passed, his voice lower now, meant for me. "You did well, Lieutenant. Some of us remember who keeps the gears turning." I nodded, words caught somewhere between pride and disbelief. He turned back to my father, saluted lightly, and said, "Your daughter's work kept good men alive. You should be proud." Then he set the microphone down and left the room as calmly as he had entered. No one spoke for several seconds. The band didn't play. The laughter was gone, replaced by a kind of stunned reverence. My father's glass was still raised halfway to his mouth, his hand trembling slightly. He lowered it slowly, cleared his throat and said something about dessert being served soon. It didn't matter. The moment had already shifted. I watched him avoid my eyes for the rest of the night. When guests approached me afterward, they spoke softly, respectfully, the way people talk to someone they've misjudged. A few apologized for laughing earlier. Most just smiled awkwardly and moved on. Later, as people danced and the music swelled again, I stepped outside for air. The night was cool, the kind of stillness you only notice when everything inside is noise. I could see my reflection faintly in the glass doors, uniform crisp, face calm, heart steady. Behind me, through the windows, my father stood alone at the bar, staring into his drink. I didn't hate him. I just finally saw him without the shine. He had built his life on medals and stories, but somewhere along the way he forgot that honor doesn't need an audience. If this story has touched something in you, leave a comment or share it. Sometimes the truth doesn't roar, it simply stands quietly until the noise runs out of breath. That night, for the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't need a speech or an apology. The silence in that hall was enough. It was the sound of a man realizing he had raised the kind of daughter he'd never understood, and maybe never could. The next morning, as the sun came through the blinds, my mother knocked on my door with coffee. She didn't say anything, just smiled, the kind of smile that says, "I saw it." I nodded. And that was all we needed. Honor doesn't always wear medals. Sometimes it wears patience. Sometimes it just waits for its turn to be seen. The morning after the wedding, the house looked like a photograph left out in the rain. Everything still stood where it should, but the shine had faded. Flower petals from my sister's bouquet were scattered along the porch steps. The coffee pot gurgled in the kitchen, the same way it had for 20 years, and yet it sounded different. My father sat at the table in his undershirt, newspaper open but unread, a half-empty mug beside him. He didn't look up when I walked in. My mother moved quietly around him, careful not to disturb the silence. I poured myself coffee and sat across from him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat and said he might have had too much to drink last night. I nodded. That was his apology. He asked if I was heading back to base soon. I said yes, in a few days. He folded the newspaper, set it down, and finally looked at me. His eyes were tired, not from age, but from the kind of exhaustion that comes when pride runs out of excuses. I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. He stood up, rinsed his cup, and left for the garage. The sound of the door closing behind him was soft, almost fragile. My mother exhaled, as if she'd been holding her breath all morning. Later that afternoon, I drove into town. The roads were quiet, fields gold under the summer sun. I stopped at a diner near the courthouse, the kind of place where the waitress knows everyone's name. She looked at my uniform, smiled, and said lunch was on the house. I thanked her, though I wasn't hungry. I just needed somewhere to sit and think. I kept seeing my father's face from the night before, frozen between pride and shame. It wasn't victory I felt. It was something closer to relief. For once, the truth had spoken, and I hadn't had to raise my voice. The wedding video circulated through the family group chat a few days later. My sister sent it with a note. It had been the most memorable night of her life. I doubt she realized how true that was. People left comments about how touching the speeches were. Someone even wrote that they hadn't known I was in the Navy. I read every word without replying. There are some things silence handles better than explanation. When I returned to base, my commanding officer called me into his office. He said the Admiral had mentioned my composure at the wedding, and that it reflected well on the service. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or salute, so I did both in my own way. He smiled and told me to take a few days of personal leave. I spent those days driving along the coast, windows down, letting the wind untangle months of tension from my shoulders. One evening, I pulled over near a small lookout point overlooking the ocean. The water was calm, endless, a mirror that didn't lie. I thought about my father, about how some men mistake authority for strength and silence for weakness. I thought about the Admiral's hand on my shoulder, and how a few quiet words had undone years of doubt. The The world didn't need to know what was in those reports I wrote. It just needed to know that my work mattered. I started keeping a small journal after that night. Not for official records, just reflections. The first page read simply, "Justice doesn't need noise. It just needs witnesses." Maybe that was my way of forgiving him, or maybe it was my way of forgiving myself for still wanting his approval. A week later, my sister called. She said, Dad hadn't been himself since the wedding. He'd stopped telling stories at the bar, stopped correcting her husband about politics, stopped laughing at his own jokes. She sounded worried, but also curious. She asked me what exactly the Admiral had meant by that speech. I told her it wasn't something I could explain over the phone. There was a long pause before she said she was proud of me. It was the first time she'd ever said it. That evening I found an envelope waiting in my mailbox. The handwriting was familiar, strong and deliberate. It was my father's. Inside was a small photograph of him holding me as a toddler in his Marine uniform. On the back, he had written, "I was proud then too." I stared at the words for a long time. They weren't enough to erase the years between us, but they were something. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with apologies. Sometimes it arrives in silence, wrapped in a memory you forgot existed. I tucked the photo into my journal and wrote underneath it, "Maybe this is what peace sounds like." Then I closed the book. The sound of the cover snapping shut reminded me of the gavel in that wedding hall, a sound that had ended one kind of silence and started another. If you've ever had to find your peace in the quiet, give this story a like or share it with someone who needs to hear it. Not every battle leaves scars you can see, and not every victory makes noise. A few months later, I visited home again. The garage smelled like oil and sawdust, just as it always had. My father was at his workbench, sanding a piece of oak. He looked up when I entered, nodded once, and handed me a mug of coffee. No speeches, no jokes. We just stood there, two people who had finally run out of things to prove. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the faint sound of church bells from town. For a moment, I thought of the Admiral, of the people whose names would never appear in reports, and of all the times I'd confused silence with defeat. Maybe real service isn't about being seen at all. Maybe it's about staying steady when the world around you gets loud. When I left that day, my father followed me to the driveway. He didn't say goodbye. He just saluted, slow and deliberate. I returned it, hand trembling slightly. For the first time, it felt like a salute between equals. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of him in the rearview mirror. He was still standing there, a small figure against the fading sun. I don't know if we'll ever talk about that night again. Maybe we don't have to. Some truths, once spoken, don't need repeating. They just settle quietly, like dust after a storm, soft but permanent. Winter arrived quietly that year, the kind that slips in without ceremony. The mornings on base started with the low hum of generators and the smell of black coffee from the mess hall. I had been assigned to training duty for new recruits, something I used to avoid, but lately it felt right, maybe because I saw pieces of my younger self in them. Eager, tense, proud, and already learning how to hide exhaustion behind composure. Most of them didn't know my story. They just knew I had a reputation for being patient but unyielding. One of them, a young sailor named Reeves, reminded me too much of myself when I first joined. Smart, careful, always trying not to take up space. During a briefing one afternoon, I noticed him hesitate to speak up about an error in a logistics report. Afterward, I called him aside and asked why he hadn't said anything. He shrugged and said no one listens to the quiet ones. I told him that was exactly why he had to speak. The world listens eventually, but only if you keep your truth steady long enough for it to echo. That night I stayed late in the office, reviewing paperwork under the soft hum of the ceiling fan. The silence was familiar, but it didn't feel lonely anymore. I thought of my father again, how his silence had once felt like rejection. Now it felt like distance closing, slowly, as if time itself was learning to breathe again. A few days later, a small package arrived from home. Inside was a model ship, carefully carved from oak. The wood was sanded smooth, the lines clean, the kind of craft only my father would have the patience for. There was no note, just the initials CF burned into the base. I set it on my desk beside the Navy crest. Every time the morning sun came through the window, it cast two shadows side by side. My mother called that weekend. She said he'd been spending more time in the garage, working on things quietly. He didn't go to the bar as much anymore. He still talked too loudly at church events and still corrected people about Marine protocol, but something in his tone had softened. She said he'd started telling neighbors that his daughter was serving in intelligence, which she delivered with the smallest laugh. I told her that was progress. The next month, I was asked to speak at a veterans outreach seminar. They wanted someone who could talk about transition, discipline, and life after service. I almost said no, I wasn't good at speeches. But then I thought about the young recruits, about Reeves, and about my father at that wedding holding his glass like a shield. So I said yes. The auditorium was modest, filled with a mix of veterans, students, and a few families. I didn't use a script. I just told the truth. I told them that service isn't always heroic, and that honor doesn't come with applause. I talked about my father, not by name, but by lesson. I told them that some people love you the best way they know how, even when it looks nothing like love. I said that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's maintenance, the kind that keeps your spirit from rusting. When the seminar ended, a few people came up to shake my hand. One older woman with a silver cane said her son had served under my father years ago. She said he'd been a tough man but fair, and that she was glad to know his daughter was carrying the torch in her own way. I smiled and told her I'd send him her regards. Back at the base that evening, I opened my journal again. I wrote about how kindness can exist in fragments, how sometimes it shows up too late but still counts. I wrote that I was beginning to understand the kind of man my father was, not because he changed overnight, but because I had. The more I understood the weight of command, the more I understood how pride can turn into armor, and how difficult it is to take it off in front of people you love. The following month, I took leave to visit home. The snow had melted, and the garden my mother loved was coming back to life. My father was outside fixing the old fence. He looked thinner, slower, but steadier. When he saw me, he nodded once, then pointed to a loose board, and asked if I could hold it while he hammered. We worked in silence for a while. Then he said the fence wasn't the only thing that needed mending. It wasn't an apology, but it didn't have to be. After we finished, we sat on the porch with coffee. He asked about my recruits, and I told him about Reeves, the quiet one. He smiled faintly and said it takes courage to stay steady when everyone else wants attention. For a moment, we were just two veterans talking about discipline. The titles of father and daughter felt less like a battlefield and more like shared ground. When I left that evening, he handed me a small box. Inside was one of his Marine pins, polished until it shone like a coin. He said it had sat in a drawer long enough. I tried to give it back, but he shook his head. He told me it was time it belonged to someone who understood the difference between power and respect. I didn't cry then, but I felt something shift. Back on base, I pinned it inside my locker door, not for display, just to remind myself of where the noise ends and the meaning begins. The recruits never saw it, but I think they felt it. The way leadership leaves traces that don't need to be announced. If you're watching this now and you've ever struggled to be seen, know this. Recognition comes and goes, but respect, the quiet kind, stays. Hit the like button or leave a comment if this story reminds you of someone who taught you something without saying a word. A few months later, during graduation for a new class of recruits, Reeves approached me after the ceremony. He said he'd learned to speak up because of that first conversation we had. He handed me a folded note that read, "Thank you for listening before anyone else did." I smiled and told him that listening is half the job. That night I went back to my quarters and took out the photo my father had sent months earlier. I looked at it under the lamplight, then at the model ship on my desk. The grain of the wood caught the glow like a slow heartbeat. I realized I didn't need another medal. This was enough. the quiet proof that honor, once earned, doesn't vanish. It just changes shape. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. Sometimes it looks like a father carving a ship for his daughter. The next chapter of this story is about what came after, how the lessons of that wedding became the foundation for something greater. If you've stayed this long, subscribe and turn on the bell. The next part will take you where this one left off, into the space between silence and legacy, where truth finally finds its home. I had spent the last 2 years leading a small team in Naval Intelligence, stationed between Washington and the Atlantic line. Most of what we did would never make it into a report anyone could read. Our job was to listen without being heard, to intercept signals that never reached the wrong hands. Some days it felt like invisible work, a constant loop of code and coordinates. But a few of those messages saved convoys, including one my father's unit rode in years ago, when he was still advising reserve operations. My name was never printed anywhere. That's how classified work goes. I never needed him to know the details. But I think some part of me wanted him to understand the kind of silence I served in, the kind that doesn't earn applause but keeps people alive. So when he laughed that night at the wedding, it wasn't anger that rose first. It was something colder, the weight of years of invisible effort being brushed off like dust on a uniform. Behind him, a man in full dress uniform quietly set down his drink. Even before I turned, I knew the silhouette. Rear Admiral Pierce. My old commanding officer. He was the kind of man who walked into a room and made stillness feel like presence. I hadn't seen him since the briefing before my reassignment. He had sent a short note afterward, saying the work we did would speak for itself one day. I guess that day had arrived. When he stepped forward, the crowd instinctively parted. The light from the chandeliers caught the silver of his ribbons. My father straightened automatically, as if muscle memory from his Marine days had pulled him to attention. I watched Pierce take the microphone with the same calm he always carried in the field. He didn't look at me right away. He looked at my father, and in that glance was everything he didn't have to explain. He spoke slowly, thanking the family for their service and congratulating the newlyweds. Then he mentioned my name, clearly, for the first time that night. He said I had served under his command. The room went still. You could hear the clink of a spoon somewhere near the bar, then nothing. He went on to describe a mission that had prevented a convoy ambush, how the intelligence gathered by a small team had saved more than one life that week. He didn't say it was mine directly, but everyone knew. My father's glass froze midair. My mother's shoulders dropped in quiet relief. That was the moment the laughter stopped. No one knew what to say, so they said nothing. Pierce finished with a brief salute and stepped back, nodding once to me before leaving the microphone behind. It wasn't revenge. It was truth finding its voice in a place where lies had been comfortable. After the speech, a few guests approached my table. One woman apologized for laughing earlier. Another said she hadn't realized I was active duty. I smiled and thanked them, but I wasn't angry anymore. The truth didn't need my defense. It had already done its job. My father never mentioned that night again, not directly. But the next morning, he left a newspaper clipping on the kitchen table. It was about a naval operation in the Atlantic, anonymous sources credited for their precision and timing. I knew he had read between the lines. When I picked it up, there was a small check mark beside the headline in his handwriting. That was enough. Years later, when I think of that night, I don't remember the laughter first. I remember the silence that came after. It was thick, almost holy, like the air after a storm passes. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about recognition, about the moment when someone finally sees you for who you are, even if they can't say it out loud. Sometimes life gives you those small, wordless victories. They don't make headlines, but they stay. If you're still here listening, take a second to like this video, or share it with someone who's been underestimated, because sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who end up learning in silence. When I went back to base after the wedding, word had spread faster than I expected. Pierce had written a short commendation letter for my file. It wasn't about the wedding. It simply said, "Lieutenant Foster demonstrates exceptional restraint and integrity in both duty and personal conduct." That was his way of saying he saw me. Reeves found out about it weeks later. He asked me what it felt like to have a superior stand up for me like that. I told him it felt like gravity returning after a long drift. Then I said something that surprised even me. Sometimes justice isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about reminding yourself you were right to begin with. That night, I walked out to the shoreline behind the base. The tide was low, the air sharp. I took a deep breath and thought of my father's laugh, the Admiral's voice, the hush that followed. It all made sense now. My father's pride had built walls around his love, but love was still there, waiting to be recognized through the cracks. The model ship sat on my desk when I returned. The initials CF caught the afternoon light. I reached out, traced the lines of the hull, and realized it wasn't just a gesture. It was an apology carved into wood. Sometimes the quietest things say the most. Months after the wedding, something inside me began to shift. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was more like the slow thaw of ice, the kind you only notice when the drip becomes a rhythm. The silence that once weighed heavy on me started to feel like a companion instead of a punishment. I began to understand that what happened that night wasn't just about my father learning something. It was about me learning how to let go of needing the world to clap before I believed in my own worth. Work on base grew steadier. I was promoted to a senior role in intelligence training, tasked with preparing junior officers for leadership. Most of them came in sharp, fast-talking, eager to prove themselves. They mistook volume for conviction, the same way I once mistook silence for weakness. I made it my job to teach them the difference. During one of our leadership sessions, a recruit named Avery challenged a point I made about restraint. She said that silence in the face of disrespect looks like surrender. I paused, remembering every dinner, every comment, every small cut that had shaped me. Then I told her that silence without confidence is surrender, but silence with conviction is control. There's a world of difference between the two. The room went quiet. I saw in their eyes that they were listening not because I demanded it, but because I had earned it. That moment became the foundation of how I trained. I started weaving my lessons around the idea that leadership isn't noise. It's steadiness. It's the ability to stay centered while everything around you shakes. I didn't tell them about the wedding, or my father, or the Admiral. I didn't need to. They felt it in the way I carried myself. Outside of work, life found its calm rhythm again. My mother sent photos of the garden blooming, my sister called more often, and my father sent small things instead of words. A hand-carved frame, a folded flag he had kept in storage, a simple card that said "proud of you." No punctuation, just the words. That was his language, and I had finally learned to read it. One weekend, I visited a local veterans center to volunteer. They were short on staff. So I helped run a workshop for returning service members adjusting to civilian life. One man, probably in his 40s, stayed behind afterward. He said he'd been having trouble talking to his teenage son, that every conversation turned into an argument. I asked him if his son knew he loved him. He said of course, but that the kid never listened. I told him maybe it wasn't that his son wasn't listening. Maybe he just couldn't hear it in the way his father was saying it. He blinked a few times, nodded, and said quietly, "That makes sense." It wasn't advice, it was recognition. Sometimes all people need is to be reminded that love and understanding rarely speak the same dialect. That night, driving back to base, I realized how much my father had taught me without ever meaning to. I learned that pride can be a kind of armor, and that real strength often looks like vulnerability dressed in discipline. For years I thought my job was to earn respect. Now I understood it was to give it first. I started a mentorship circle for female officers soon after. We met once a month in a small conference room that smelled like old coffee and ambition. We talked about everything the manuals left out: how to command without losing compassion, how to stand tall when people question your worth, how to forgive yourself when you break under pressure. I told them stories from my deployments, from training, and sometimes from my family. Not to teach, but to connect. To remind them that service doesn't stop when the mission ends. It just changes form. One night after a session, a young lieutenant lingered behind. She said she had grown up in a military family too, and that her father didn't understand her decision to join. She asked if that ever changed. I smiled and said eventually it does, but not always in the way you expect. Sometimes understanding arrives in the quiet things, a phone call, a letter, a gesture that doesn't need explaining. When she left, I sat alone in the room for a while. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead. I thought about the model ship on my desk, the marine pin in my locker, and the photograph tucked into my journal. All small, quiet things. Together, they told the story of a woman who had stopped fighting for recognition and started leading with grace. A few months later, I received an invitation to an awards ceremony at the Pentagon. It wasn't a personal honor but a team commendation. Still, I felt something settle inside me. My father couldn't attend, but he called the morning of the event. He said he'd watched the Navy broadcast once and thought I looked taller in uniform. I laughed and said maybe it was the shoes. He didn't laugh back, just said, "I mean it. You look strong." Then the line went quiet. I think that was his way of saying everything else he couldn't. That evening, standing among officers and guests, I thought about all the invisible people who hold up the weight of the world. Analysts, translators, nurses, clerks, every silent soldier who keeps the machine running. They never make speeches or headlines, but they are the ones who keep the noise from drowning out the mission. That realization became the core of how I lived afterward. If this story has reached you tonight, remember this. You don't have to be loud to be remembered. Sometimes dignity speaks loudest when it whispers. Like this video or share it with someone who reminds you of quiet strength. Maybe they need to hear that silence is not absence, it's endurance. The next year I was promoted again. During the ceremony, I looked out into the audience and saw a familiar figure standing near the back. My father. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain suit, hands behind his back. Our eyes met for a second. He nodded, and I nodded back. That was all. It was enough. Later, as I walked out of the hall, I found him waiting near the exit. He said the drive had been long, but he wanted to be there. I thanked him. He looked down for a moment, then said, "You were right to wear the uniform that day." I didn't know what to say. I just smiled, and we stood in silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of distance. It was the silence of understanding. That night, I wrote one last entry in my journal. It said, "Some stories end with applause. Mine ends with quiet respect." The Admiral walked up to the microphone. The crowd quieted as if someone had drawn a curtain across the room. His shoes echoed against the marble floor, each step steady, deliberate. He stopped near the front table where my father sat, glass in hand, mid-conversation. You could feel the air shift. Conversations tapered off, forks froze mid-air. The kind of stillness that only happens when something important is about to be said. The Admiral cleared his throat and began speaking with the same calm authority that had once filled entire operation rooms. He thanked the guests for gathering, then turned toward my father. He said, "Colonel Foster, you raised a fine analyst. Her reports prevented 3 ambushes overseas, including one that saved your unit." The room went silent. My father froze, glass halfway raised. For a second, I thought he might laugh again, try to fill the space with sound the way he always did when emotions got too close. But he didn't. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the Admiral. I watched the color drain from his face as the weight of the words landed. The same mouth that once mocked me couldn't find a single word. He looked at me, not as his daughter, but as someone he'd misjudged. And for once, he had no joke left. The Admiral gave a small nod toward me before stepping away from the microphone. He didn't say another word. He didn't have to. The truth was already standing on its own. Applause broke out slowly, not loud or theatrical, just a ripple of genuine respect moving through the crowd. My father set his glass down, hands trembling slightly. My mother touched his arm, her expression soft, proud, a little sad. After the ceremony, people came to shake my hand, to ask about the missions I couldn't talk about. I answered with what I could, but my mind kept returning to the way my father had looked at me in that frozen moment. That was the first time I saw humility in his eyes. It wasn't a weakness. It was recognition. Later in the hallway outside the banquet room, he found me. The crowd's chatter was still audible behind the doors. He said my name quietly, almost carefully, as if testing how it felt to speak it with respect. I turned and waited. He didn't apologize. He didn't need to. He just said, "You did good work." And then he reached into his jacket pocket and handed me an old photograph. It was the one from years ago, him in uniform holding me as a toddler. I had thought he'd lost it. On the back, in his handwriting, was a single line. "Some things don't need to be said out loud." I held that photo in my hand, the edges worn smooth, and felt something loosen in my chest. Years of tension, misunderstanding, pride all dissolving quietly between us. I slipped the photo into my coat pocket and nodded. That was our truce. That night, back in my quarters, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the city lights blur into lines of gold. The Admiral's words echoed in my head, but it was my father's silence that stayed. Sometimes silence can be louder than applause. The next morning, the Admiral stopped by my office before leaving town. He didn't talk about the speech. He just said, "The hardest missions are the ones at home. Keep leading the way you do." Then he smiled, a rare thing from him, and walked out. In the days that followed, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't known before. It wasn't the triumphant kind. It was quieter, deeper, the kind that comes when you stop needing to be understood and start simply existing in truth. I realized that what had happened at the ceremony wasn't just a revelation for my father. It was a turning point for me. If you're watching this, maybe you've had someone doubt you too. Maybe they made you feel small. If that sounds familiar, take a second to like this video, or share it with someone who needs to be reminded. Time has a way of making the truth visible, even when you stop fighting for it. Weeks later, my father called me on a Sunday morning. He asked about the recruits, about my schedule, about whether I still had that model ship he'd made. I said yes, it was still on my desk. He said, "Good, keep it there. It'll remind you who you are when things get noisy." I could hear a smile in his voice, faint but real. That was the first normal conversation we'd had in years. The story could have ended there, and maybe it should have, but life rarely wraps things up neatly. Months later, during a field exercise with my trainees, I found myself repeating the Admiral's words without realizing it. I told them the hardest missions are the ones at home. They didn't fully understand, but they listened. And I thought, maybe that's what legacy really is, not medals or speeches, but lessons passed quietly from one soul to another. The night before graduation, Reeves and Avery dropped by my office. They brought a small wooden plaque they'd made, engraved with a line they'd taken from my journal entries I'd shared during class. It read, "Quiet strength is still strength." They said they wanted to hang it in the training hall. I agreed, though my voice caught slightly. As they left, I looked around the office. The flag folded in the corner, the model ship by the window, the marine pin in my locker. Every piece of it told a story that no one would ever fully know. But that was all right. Some stories don't need to be loud to last. If you've stayed until now, thank you. Stories like this aren't about revenge anymore. They're about truth, about honor, about finding peace after noise. If you felt something in this journey, hit the like button, or leave a comment about the quiet victories in your life, because sometimes those are the ones that matter most. Years passed quietly. The way time moves when you stop measuring it by victories and start measuring it by peace. My days were filled with cadets, paperwork, and the rhythm of life on base. The mornings always started with the same smell of coffee and salt air drifting in from the coast. The laughter in the mess hall changed faces every few months, but the sound was always the same. I had stayed long enough to see the cycle of young recruits come and go, each one carrying a spark of who I once was. Some eager, some afraid, all trying to prove something. By then, my hair had more gray in it than I liked to admit, and the model ship on my desk had gathered a thin layer of dust. Every time I thought of cleaning it, I stopped myself. The dust was part of the story now. It reminded me that even the strongest things age gracefully when they've served their purpose. I kept in touch with Reeves after he transferred to another unit. He wrote once a year, always on the same date, to tell me where life had taken him. The last letter said he had taken over training new analysts. He said he used to start every session with a phrase I'd told him once. "Quiet strength is still strength." It made me smile. Maybe this was how legacy worked, not through ceremony but through small ripples in people's lives. One evening my mother called. Her voice was softer than usual. She said Dad hadn't been feeling well, that the doctors were concerned about his heart. I took leave the next day and drove straight home. The house looked smaller somehow, as if time had folded it in on itself. The same photos lined the hallway, but one frame was missing, the one he had given me years ago. When I walked into his room, he was sitting by the window, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the fading light. He looked up and smiled faintly when he saw me. We didn't talk much that first night. I made tea, he pretended to drink it, and we watched the sun sink behind the trees. The silence between us no longer felt heavy. It was something gentler now, an old song we both knew by heart. Over the next few days, I helped around the house, fixed things that didn't need fixing, and stayed close enough for him to feel it without having to say anything. On the third morning, he asked me to bring the box from his closet. Inside were his old medals, photographs, and a folded flag. He asked me to help him organize them. As we worked, he started telling stories I'd never heard, about the soldiers he'd lost, the mistakes he'd made, the promises he'd tried to keep. For the first time, he spoke without the shield of pride. His voice trembled in places. When he finished, he handed me one of his medals and said, "You should have had this years ago." I told him I didn't need it, but he insisted. He said, "It's not for what you did. It's for who you are." That night as he slept, I sat by his bed and watched his chest rise and fall. The years of distance between us had finally narrowed to the space of that room. I realized forgiveness doesn't always arrive in words. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet act of being there. He passed away a few weeks later. The funeral was small, military precision, folded flags, the low echo of a bugle. I wore my uniform, the same one he once told me not to wear to the wedding. As the officer handed me the folded flag, I caught sight of the model ship sitting on the table beside the casket. My mother had brought it from my desk. Its wood gleamed softly in the morning sun. That sight broke something open inside me, not in pain, but in gratitude. I finally understood what the Admiral had meant years ago, when he said the hardest missions are the ones at home. In the months after the funeral, I returned to teaching. The recruits never knew about that part of my life, but I carried it with me in every lesson. When someone made a mistake, I didn't shout. When someone doubted themselves, I reminded them that respect doesn't come from rank. It comes from steadiness. I told them the truest kind of leadership is born from listening. A new generation arrived faster, louder, full of questions the world didn't always have answers for. I learned to let them talk, to let their noise fill the room, because I knew that someday they'd learn the value of silence on their own. Reeves visited one summer and joined me for a lecture. Watching him speak, confident and composed, I realized that the work we do outlives us in people, not in medals or titles. Years later, after retirement, I moved to a small house near the water. The mornings there are still and quiet. I walk the beach at dawn, the waves soft against the sand, the horizon endless. Sometimes I think I hear my father's voice in the wind, faint and proud. I keep the model ship on a shelf by the window. The sun hits it every morning, and it still casts two shadows, one mine, one his. If you're hearing this, remember that silence is not emptiness. It's space, space to forgive, to listen, to build something lasting. Honor doesn't fade with age. It just changes form, from words to memories, from applause to understanding. If this story stays with you, leave a comment, share it, or subscribe for more stories like this one. Because sometimes the quietest endings are the ones that echo the longest. After the ceremony ended, the crowd slowly thinned out. The sound of chairs scraping across the floor, soft laughter, and the low hum of polite conversation filled the hall again. But my father hadn't moved. He stood near the back, glass in hand, watching me. I could tell he was searching for the right words, the ones that had never come easily to him. When he finally walked forward, the people nearby stepped aside as if they knew this was a moment that belonged only to us. He stopped a few feet away, hesitated, then straightened his shoulders. His hand went up in a slow, deliberate motion. A salute. Clean. Precise. The kind that comes from years of muscle memory, but this time it carried something more. I returned it quietly, eyes steady, heartbeat calm. No words, no explanations. That was enough. Afterward, we walked outside together. The night air was cool, the streetlights flickering against the wet pavement. We didn't speak for a while. Sometimes silence carries more honesty than 1,000 apologies. When we reached the parking lot, he finally said, "I never understood what you did, but I see it now." He didn't look at me when he said it. He just stared out toward the lights of the base in the distance. I nodded. It was all either of us needed. As I watched him drive away, I realized the moment wasn't about victory or proving anyone wrong. It was about correction. The kind that doesn't humiliate but heals. The kind that restores balance without asking for anything in return. This wasn't revenge, it was correction. In the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about how small gestures can close the widest gaps. A salute. A shared silence. A single acknowledgement that shifts years of misunderstanding into something close to peace. Maybe that's what justice really is, not the loud moment when the truth explodes, but the quiet one when it settles. Back on base, life went on as usual. New faces arrived, new reports piled up. The same routine that had once felt endless now felt like purpose. I caught myself smiling more often. The past no longer felt heavy. It had done its job and moved on. I started taking morning runs again, not to outrun anything this time, but just to breathe. Sometimes when I passed the flagpole at dawn, I thought of my father standing there that night, his salute caught in the glow of the hallway lights. I wondered if he ever realized how much that one act meant to me. Probably not. But maybe that's the beauty of it. Not everything worth remembering needs to be said out loud. If you've ever been underestimated, remember this. You don't have to shout to prove your worth. Keep showing up. Keep doing the work. The truth will speak when it's ready. It always does. When I finished my final assignment before retirement, the Admiral sent me a handwritten note. It simply said, "You stood your ground. That's leadership." I framed it and hung it in the training hall, not as a trophy, but as a reminder to those who would come after. Strength doesn't need volume. Dignity doesn't need defense. Years later, when I see young officers stepping into the same roles, eager and unsure, I think about all the moments that built me. The laughter, the silence, the correction. Each one taught me that integrity isn't loud. It's steady. It's the heartbeat of every soldier who chooses patience over pride. If you felt something in this story, like this video, or share it with someone who's walked a quiet road. Sometimes the people who make the least noise carry the most strength. Years later, I found myself standing on the same parade field where my career had started. The morning air carried that familiar scent of dew and engine oil, the sound of boots hitting concrete in perfect rhythm. I was no longer part of the formation, but an observer now, watching a new generation take the oath I once did. Their uniforms looked sharper, their eyes brighter, but I knew the same mix of pride and fear lived beneath the surface. The commander's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, and I felt the weight of memory settle gently over me. Every step, every order, every lesson had brought me to this point. Behind me, a small group of recruits whispered as they recognized who I was. One of them approached after the ceremony, holding a training manual against her chest. She asked if it was true that I once led the intelligence team that prevented the convoy ambush. I told her yes, but the real story wasn't about the mission. It was about learning that strength doesn't always sound like thunder. Sometimes it's the quiet decision you make to do what's right when no one's looking. She nodded, listening closely, the same way I used to when the Admiral spoke. Before she left, she asked if I had any advice for her. I said. Lead with silence, speak with purpose. She smiled, and I saw in her the beginning of something familiar. When the crowd dispersed, I walked alone toward the old flagpole near the edge of the field. The wind picked up, tugging lightly at my jacket. For a moment, I thought of my father again, the way he had saluted me that night. It was a memory that had softened with time, no longer sharp, just warm. I realized then that his salute had never truly ended. It lived on in the way I carried myself, in every nod I gave a new recruit, in every steady word I offered to someone who doubted their own worth. At home, the model ship still sat by the window. Its wood had darkened with age, but it remained intact, unbroken. Beside it was the marine pin he had given me, and a folded flag that caught the morning light. Every now and then, I dusted them off, not as rituals but as reminders. Legacy isn't something you leave behind. It's something that keeps breathing through the people you've taught, the lives you've touched, the silence you've honored. One afternoon, I received a letter from Reeves. He wrote that he'd taken command of a unit overseas, and that he was using many of the same training principles I'd taught him. He said there were days when things felt heavy, when leadership was more burden than pride, but that he remembered what I once told him. Quiet strength is still strength. At the bottom of the letter, he'd written a single line that made me pause. We keep the noise out so the truth can be heard. I sat there reading those words, the sound of the waves outside brushing against the shore. Maybe that's what all of this had been about, creating enough quiet for others to find their voice. I didn't need to be remembered by name. I just wanted the lesson to last. If you're listening to this now, maybe you've carried your own kind of silence. Maybe you've been overlooked or dismissed. Let me tell you something I wish someone had told me years ago. You don't have to prove your worth to anyone who refuses to see it. Just keep doing the work. Keep standing your ground. The truth will speak when it's ready. And when it does, it won't need to shout. I spend most evenings on the porch now, watching the sunset slip into the sea. The sky turns the same soft amber that used to fall through the chapel windows at every ceremony I ever attended. Sometimes, I raise my coffee in a quiet toast, not to victories or medals, but to every person who chose honor over attention. I imagine my father sitting somewhere just beyond that horizon, nodding in his old, stubborn way. This story isn't about revenge. It's about return. About coming home to yourself after years of trying to be understood. About realizing that the respect you waited for doesn't have to come from others. It can start right here, in the quiet certainty that you did your duty, that you stood tall when it mattered. So if this story has stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone who taught you to stand your ground without shouting, like this video or share it with them. Maybe they need to hear that silence is not weakness. It's wisdom waiting for its time. And if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of dignity, truth, and the quiet victories that shape us, subscribe to Military Revenge, because sometimes the loudest honor belongs to those who never asked for it.